My husband promised to love me forever, then tried to strip me of everything I owned, even my grandmother's estate. In court, he laughed as if I was already defeated. But that laugh died the second I revealed the evidence that turned his betrayal into his downfall. Love, loyalty, and trust, they're supposed to be the foundation of every marriage. But what happens when the person you trust most is secretly plotting your downfall? This isn't just a story about divorce. It's a story about betrayal, arrogance, and the sweetest revenge served right where it hurts the most, in front of a judge and everyone watching. Before I share how I turned my husband's scheme into his ultimate humiliation, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you love powerful stories of justice and revenge, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what's coming next. My name is Evelyn Carter, and for 22 years, I wore the title of wife like a badge of honor. I believed in love and loyalty, in the idea that marriage was something sacred. And for a long time, I thought my husband, Richard Carter, believed that too. He was charming when we first met, thoughtful, attentive, the kind of man who pulled out chairs and opened doors, who remembered my favorite flowers and left little notes on the kitchen counter. Everyone who knew us said we were the perfect couple. My grandmother, Margaret, adored him. She used to tell me, "Evelyn, that man looks at you the way your grandfather used to look at me." That kind of devotion is rare. I clung to those words. I wanted them to be true. But the truth is, sometimes love blinds you to the cracks forming just beneath the surface. The first signs were subtle. Richard began working late more often. At first, I believed him. He had a demanding job in finance, and overtime came with the territory. But then there were the nights he wouldn't come home until dawn, reeking of expensive whiskey and someone else's perfume. When I asked, he brushed me off with a tired smile and a dismissive, "You're overthinking, Evelyn. I'd never hurt you." I wanted to believe him, so I did. But lies, no matter how well told, leave stains. I had built my life around more than just love. When my grandmother passed away, she left me her estate, a sprawling piece of land with an old but beautiful house, built from stone, and that had stood for more than a century. To me, it wasn't just property. It was family history. Every corner of that house carried her presence. The creak in the staircase, the scent of lavender that never seemed to fade from the curtains, the garden she planted with her own hands. Richard used to say he loved it too. He'd walk the grounds with me, talk about how our grandchildren would one day play hide-and-seek between the trees, how we'd host Christmas dinners in the great hall like something out of a fairy tale. I thought he shared my dream, but money has a way of changing people. As his career advanced, Richard's tastes grew more extravagant. He bought luxury cars, tailored suits, watches worth more than some people's homes. I didn't mind at first. We had money, my family's money largely, and I thought, why not enjoy it? But soon, I realized he wasn't just spending. He was gambling. He was investing recklessly, chasing high returns like a man possessed. And every time one of his schemes failed, he grew more bitter, more resentful. One night, over a bottle of wine, he sneered at me and said, "Must be nice, Evelyn, to sit on an inheritance while I'm the one out there grinding every day." The words cut deeper than he knew. My grandmother's estate wasn't just an inheritance. It was the soul of my family. And Richard, the man I trusted with my heart, was beginning to see it as nothing more than a pile of dollar signs. Still, I tried to save us. I suggested counseling, weekend getaways, even something as simple as unplugging from work and reconnecting. But Richard always had an excuse. Too busy, too tired, too important. What I didn't know then was that he was already making plans, not for our future, but for my downfall. I'll never forget the day I stumbled across the first real sign of his betrayal. I was cleaning his office, something I rarely did, when I found a folder tucked behind the books on his shelf. Inside were financial statements, not just of his accounts, but of mine. He had printed copies of my grandmother's will, details of the estate, even valuations from real estate agents. My hands trembled as I flipped through the papers. Why would he need those? The answer came weeks later when Richard casually mentioned divorce. Not in a fight, not in anger. He said it over breakfast, his voice cold, detached. "Evelyn, maybe we should think about going our separate ways." I remember staring at him, fork frozen halfway to my mouth. Divorce? After 22 years. He shrugged as if it were nothing. People grow apart. It happens. But I knew better. From that moment on, everything changed. The man I thought loved me had become a stranger in my own home. He stayed out later, barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was with irritation, as though I was some obstacle standing in his way. I confided in a friend, who happened to be a lawyer, and what she told me shook me to my core. Evelyn, if Richard files for divorce, he could go after half your assets, including the estate. Half! The word echoed in my head like a curse. Half of everything my grandmother had worked for. Half of the property that had been in my family for generations. Half of my soul. I couldn't let that happen. And in that moment, I made a vow. If Richard wanted war, then war was what he would get. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't the naive woman he thought I was. He believed I was weak, sentimental, unprepared. But the truth? I had been raised by a woman who taught me never to surrender what was rightfully mine. So, while Richard plotted to strip me of everything, I quietly began plotting too. And when the day came to face him in court, he would learn that betrayal carries a price, one far heavier than he ever imagined. The official papers arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sipping tea by the window when the knock came. The envelope was thick, stamped with the seal of the county court, and my hands shook before I even tore it open. Inside were the words I had both feared and expected: petition for dissolution of marriage. Richard hadn't even bothered to tell me himself. He let a stranger deliver the blow that was supposed to shatter my world. But I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I sat down at my grandmother's oak desk, the same one she used to manage the estate, and I read every word. His demands were clear: half of everything. The house we had lived in, the cars, the accounts, the estate. Especially the estate. He wanted to gut my life and take the heart of my family's legacy. 2 days later, Richard came home earlier than usual, smirking like he had just won the lottery. He tossed his coat onto the couch and poured himself a drink before turning to me with that smug grin. "Did you get the papers?" he asked, as if it were nothing more than a bill in the mail. I nodded, my voice steady. "I got them." "Good," he said, sipping his whiskey. "This will be easier if you don't fight it. Sign where you need to sign, and we can both move on. You'll be taken care of course. Half is fair." I wanted to laugh at the audacity. Half. He was trying to play the role of a generous man while carving my life apart. But I kept my face calm, almost serene. He mistook my silence for defeat, and in that moment, I realized just how arrogant he had become. Richard didn't see me as a person anymore. He saw me as a wallet, as a bank to be raided before he moved on to whatever shiny new life he thought awaited him. What Richard didn't know was that I had already contacted my lawyer friend, Clara Jennings, the same woman I had confided in weeks earlier. Clara wasn't just any lawyer. She was ruthless, sharp, and brilliant in family law. The kind of attorney men like Richard underestimated until it was far too late. We met in secret, away from the house. In the back room of a cafe, I laid everything out for her: the estate, the inheritance, the financial records I had found in Richard's office. Clara listened carefully, her eyes narrowing at the details. "Evelyn," she said finally, "if the estate was inherited and never commingled with marital assets, it's legally yours. He doesn't have a claim." I felt a spark of hope ignite inside me. "So he can't touch it?" "Not if we handle this correctly," Clara said. "But we'll need documentation. Every deed, every will, every paper trail that proves it's separate property. If he tries to contest it, we'll be ready." For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small smile. Richard thought he held all the cards. He had no idea I was quietly building a fortress around the very thing he wanted most. The weeks leading up to court were some of the hardest of my life. Richard became unbearable at home. He paraded his arrogance, coming and going as he pleased, talking on the phone in hushed tones I wasn't supposed to hear. Once, I caught him laughing with a friend, saying, "By the end of this, Evelyn will be lucky if she has a penny to her name." That night, I cried, not for him, not even for the betrayal, but for the sheer cruelty of it. How could someone I once loved wish such ruin on me? But every tear steeled my resolve. If he wanted war, he'd get it. I began gathering everything Clara requested. Old deeds, bank statements, even letters from my grandmother that mentioned her intentions for the estate. I hired appraisers, accountants, anyone who could help me draw the clearest possible line between my inheritance and Richard's greedy hands. Richard, meanwhile, strutted around like a man already victorious. He talked about buying a new condo downtown, a European vacation, even a yacht. He thought the money was already his. I said nothing, because the quieter I stayed, the more careless he became. When the day of our first court hearing arrived, Richard walked into the courthouse in a tailored suit, his chin high, a gleam in his eye. He looked at me as though I were already defeated, a relic of a life he was ready to discard. He leaned in as we waited for the judge to enter and whispered, "You should have signed, Evelyn. Now you're just wasting everyone's time." I met his gaze, calm and unshaken. "We'll see." The truth was, Richard had no idea what was coming. He thought he'd stripped me of everything, love, dignity, hope. But in his arrogance, he'd overlooked the one thing that would cost him everything, my determination. And as the gavel struck to begin proceedings, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Because I wasn't walking into a courtroom to lose. I was walking in to fight. And Richard was about to learn what happens when a man underestimates the wrong woman. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where lives are dissected in front of strangers. For me, it was a battlefield, and Richard strutted across it like a conquering general. He sat beside his attorney, a flashy man named Daniel Briggs, who wore his arrogance like cologne. Together, they looked smug, confident, and utterly certain of victory. Richard leaned back in his chair, flashing that self-satisfied grin I had come to loathe. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Richard's posture was stiff, rehearsed, the performance of a man who wanted the whole room to believe he was a victim of circumstance, a husband who had selflessly given years to a loveless marriage. The lies flowed as smoothly as the silk tie around his neck. "Your Honor," his lawyer began. My client, Richard Carter, dedicated decades of his life to supporting his wife. Together, they built a life of wealth and prosperity. But now, as their marriage comes to a close, Mrs. Carter seeks to deny him what is rightfully his, half of the assets they accumulated during the marriage. I clench my fists beneath the table. Half of the assets we accumulated. That was his story. Briggs continued, "This includes the Carter estate, a property which, while inherited, was maintained and improved with marital funds and efforts. Mr. Carter has a legal claim to it, and we intend to prove that claim." Richard sat there nodding solemnly, as if he were the aggrieved party. It was almost laughable, the man who gambled away fortunes now painting himself as a dutiful husband robbed of his fair share. When it was Clara's turn, she rose with the poise of a seasoned warrior. "Your Honor, the estate in question is the sole inheritance of my client, Evelyn Carter, passed down through her grandmother. We will present clear documentation proving it was never commingled with marital funds and has always remained separate property. Mr. Carter's claim is not only baseless, but a deliberate attempt to strip my client of her family's legacy." Her voice was calm, steady, but every word landed like a hammer. I felt a surge of gratitude. Clara wasn't just defending me, she was defending generations of my family. Richard chuckled under his breath, leaning toward his lawyer. I caught the whisper. "She's bluffing. Evelyn wouldn't have the guts to fight this hard." That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. Richard still thought I was weak. He still believed he was untouchable. And that arrogance was about to be his undoing. The first few hearings dragged on with paperwork, testimonies, and preliminary arguments. Richard behaved as though it were all a formality. He arrived each day in expensive suits, nodding at people like he was a celebrity. He smirked at me across the courtroom, sometimes mouthing words like "it's over" or "enjoy your half." But while he played the role of victor, I played the role of silence. I let him underestimate me. I let him laugh. Meanwhile, Clara and I built our case brick by brick. We brought in old tax records, showing no marital funds ever touched the estate. We secured testimony from my grandmother's former attorney, who confirmed her explicit wishes that the estate remained solely in my name. We even found photographs and letters proving that the renovations Richard bragged about funding had actually been paid for with my inheritance accounts, not his. Piece by piece, we stacked the evidence like dynamite, waiting for the perfect moment to ignite it. One afternoon, during a recess, Richard cornered me in the hallway. His smile was venomous. "You don't have to drag this out, Evelyn," he said. "Settle now, and I'll be generous. Walk away with a decent amount, and maybe I won't ruin you completely." For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Because behind his arrogance, I saw the truth. He was scared. He hid it well, but his eyes flickered when he spoke. He needed me to fold. He needed me to surrender. I leaned in, keeping my voice calm. "Richard, the only thing you'll ruin is yourself." I walked away before he could respond, leaving him sputtering in disbelief. By the third week of proceedings, even the judge was growing tired of Richard's theatrics. He interrupted often, contradicted himself on the stand, and once even snapped at Clara, earning a sharp rebuke from the bench. His confidence was starting to crack. Clara leaned toward me one afternoon and whispered, "He's hanging himself, Evelyn. All we need is the right moment to pull the rope." And I knew exactly when that moment would come. Because Richard didn't know that deep in my files, tucked safely away, was a piece of evidence so devastating, so undeniable, that when revealed, it would obliterate his entire case in a single stroke. For now, I let him laugh. For now, I let him gloat. But soon his laughter would die. The morning of the decisive hearing felt different. The courthouse was the same, the judge the same. Even Richard's smug grin hadn't changed. But in my gut, I knew the storm we'd been preparing for was about to break. I wore my grandmother's locket around my neck, a small token of strength. As I touched it for reassurance, Clara leaned close and whispered, "Today's the day. We go in quiet, we come out with everything." Richard didn't notice the tension in the air. He strutted into the courtroom like a king returning to his throne. He winked at me, as if mocking the calm expression I wore. He had no idea that calm was the mask of victory. The proceedings began with Richard's attorney, Daniel Briggs, launching into yet another tirade about how Richard had contributed to the estate. "Your Honor, we have substantial evidence that Mr. Carter invested marital funds into renovations and upkeep of the Carter estate, entitling him to an equitable share." The judge nodded, scribbling notes. It wasn't the first time I'd heard these lies, and I kept my face neutral. Then Richard himself took the stand. He spun a tale about how he had funded roof repairs, landscaping, even a new heating system. He spoke with such conviction that anyone unfamiliar with the truth might have believed him. But I knew better, and so did Clara. When it was her turn, Clara rose slowly, deliberately. Her eyes locked on Richard, unflinching. "Mr. Carter, you testified under oath that you paid for renovations to the Carter estate using marital funds, correct?" "That's right," he said smugly. Clara opened a folder on the table and lifted a series of documents. "Then can you explain why every receipt, every invoice for those renovations, traces back to Evelyn Carter's inheritance account, an account legally separate from your joint finances?" A hush fell over the room. The judge leaned forward. "Is this accurate, Mr. Carter?" Richard's face paled. He stammered, searching for words. I don't recall. Evelyn must have." Clara didn't give him time. She placed another document before the court. "Your Honor, this is a notarized statement from the contractor who performed the renovations. He confirms he was paid directly by Mrs. Carter from her inheritance account. Not a single payment came from Mr. Carter." The silence was deafening. Richard's mask of confidence cracked for the first time. And then came the final blow. Clara retrieved one last document, sliding it across to the judge with the precision of a blade. "Furthermore, Your Honor, this is the original will of Margaret Holloway, Evelyn's grandmother. It explicitly states the estate is to remain solely in Evelyn Carter's name, not to be sold, transferred, or divided. The estate is protected as non-marital property. Any attempt to claim otherwise is a violation of her testamentary intent." The judge adjusted his glasses, reading the highlighted lines. His expression hardened. "Mr. Carter, do you have a response to this?" Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His lawyer tried to intervene, stammering about further review, but it was too late. The evidence was clear. Ironclad. Devastating. For the first time, Richard wasn't smirking. He wasn't laughing. He was drowning. I watched him from across the courtroom, my hands folded calmly in my lap. My heart pounded, but not from fear. From justice. For months, he had treated me like a fool, like a weak woman he could manipulate and discard. He thought he could take my grandmother's legacy, my family's soul, and reduce it to a dollar amount. But in that moment, as the judge scolded him for misleading testimony and Clara's evidence struck like thunder, I saw the truth in his eyes. Richard finally understood. He wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. The hearing adjourned with the judge stating he would review the overwhelming documentation before rendering a decision. But everyone in that room already knew how this was going to end. Clara gathered the papers neatly, sliding them back into her bag. She gave me a small nod, not triumphant, not arrogant, just certain. As we stood to leave, Richard turned to me, his face flushed with rage and desperation. "You think you've won, Evelyn? This isn't over." I met his glare with quiet steel. "It's over, Richard. You just don't know it yet." That night, I sat alone in my grandmother's estate. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock. I walked through the halls, touching the worn wooden banisters, smelling the faint lavender in the curtains, and for the first time in months, I breathed freely. This place wasn't just mine. It was untouchable, protected, safe, and Richard had no power here anymore. But even then, I knew the battle wasn't fully finished. Men like him don't surrender gracefully. They claw, they scheme, they fight to the bitter end. And I was ready for every last move he had left. The day of the final ruling came faster than I expected. Weeks of preparation, months of fear, and years of betrayal all led to this moment. I arrived at the courthouse early, sitting quietly at the wooden bench outside the courtroom. My palms were warm, but my mind was still. Richard, on the other hand, stormed in late. His tie was crooked, his hair unkempt, a shadow of the man who once strutted through these halls like he owned them. He didn't look like a husband. He didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man cornered. When the bailiff called the court to order, a heavy silence fell. The judge began with a stern voice. "We are here to render judgment on the Carter divorce proceedings, specifically regarding the ownership of the Holloway estate." His eyes lingered on Richard for a beat too long. "I have reviewed the evidence submitted, including financial records, contractor statements, and the original testamentary documents of the Holloway estate." My breath caught in my chest. This was it. "Mr. Carter," the judge continued, "your claims of financial contribution have been found unsubstantiated. All payments for renovations and upkeep were made solely from Mrs. Carter's inheritance account. Furthermore, the Holloway will clearly states the estate is to remain in Mrs. Carter's name as separate property." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge raised his gavel for silence. "It is the ruling of this court that the Holloway estate remains the sole and exclusive property of Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Mr. Carter has no legal claim." For a heartbeat, I didn't move, didn't breathe, and then it washed over me. Relief, vindication, freedom. But the judge wasn't finished. "In addition, Mr. Carter, it has come to the court's attention that you knowingly provided false testimony regarding your financial contributions. This court does not take perjury lightly." His tone sharpened. "While I am not sentencing you today, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for further review." Richard's face drained of all color. He slumped in his seat, his hands trembling on the table. Clara whispered, "There it is." I couldn't stop the tears that welled in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a woman who had carried a mountain of betrayal and was finally setting it down. Richard's lawyer attempted one last desperate plea. "Your Honor, surely we can appeal." "Appeal all you want." The judge cut him off, but the evidence speaks for itself. He slammed the gavel. "Court is adjourned." The sound of that gavel was more than wood striking wood. It was the sound of chains breaking. As the crowd shuffled out, Richard staggered to his feet. His eyes met mine, burning with hatred. "You think this makes you strong," he hissed. "You'll regret this. No one humiliates me and gets away with it." For the first time in our marriage, I didn't shrink from his anger. I didn't cower. I didn't argue. I simply looked him in the eye and said, "You humiliated yourself. I just survived it." He flinched like I had struck him. And in a way I had, because truth cuts sharper than any blade. Outside, the autumn air felt crisper than ever. Clara hugged me tightly. "You did it, Evelyn. You won." I shook my head, correcting her softly. "We did it. And it wasn't about winning. It was about protecting what was mine, what my grandmother entrusted to me. Clara smiled, though her eyes glistened. Richard thought he could erase your strength. Instead, you showed him what real strength looks like. That evening, I walked through the Holloway estate with renewed purpose. The walls no longer felt haunted by Richard's threats. The floors didn't echo with fear. Instead, the house felt alive again, like it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to reclaim it. I stopped in front of my grandmother's portrait, the one that hung above the fireplace. Her kind eyes seemed to shine with approval. I whispered, "It's safe now. Your legacy is safe." And for the first time since Richard's betrayal began, I slept peacefully in the home that was always mine. But even in victory, a thought lingered. Richard wasn't the type of man to vanish quietly. He had lost his case, his claim, his power, but not his bitterness. And though I had won the battle, I knew I had to remain vigilant. Because sometimes, the most dangerous man is the one with nothing left to lose. For a few weeks after the ruling, life settled into a rhythm I had almost forgotten was possible. I woke without fear. I brewed coffee without glancing over my shoulder. The estate was mine again, not just in name but in spirit. But men like Richard don't simply fade away. They linger like shadows, clawing at whatever scraps of power they can still grasp. It began with late-night phone calls. At first, they were silent, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. Then came the muttering, curses spoken low and jagged, his voice soaked in venom. "You think you're safe," he growled one night, "but you'll regret crossing me." I hung up and locked every door in the house, though I knew locks alone couldn't keep out the kind of hatred Richard carried. Clara advised me to file for a restraining order. "He's unraveling," she warned. "This isn't just about money anymore. It's about his pride." She was right. Richard's pride was a beast all its own, one that could never accept defeat. And sure enough, his obsession escalated. I noticed his car idling down the road from the estate late at night. Neighbors whispered that they'd seen him drinking alone in bars, ranting about how I had ruined his life. But what chilled me most was the letter. It arrived in an unmarked envelope slid under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with jagged handwriting. "If I can't have the estate, then neither can you." My stomach twisted as I read those words. The very next night, it happened. I woke to the acrid stench of smoke. My heart lurched as I leapt from bed and saw flickers of orange light dancing against the curtains. The estate was on fire. For a split second, panic paralyzed me. This home, my grandmother's legacy, the place I had fought so hard to protect, was being devoured before my eyes. But survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice shaking as I shouted the address. Then I raced through the halls, ensuring no one else was inside. The flames spread fast, licking at the drapes and crawling across the wooden beams. The house groaned, as if mourning its own destruction. And then I saw him. Through the haze of smoke outside, Richard stood at the edge of the driveway, a gas can at his feet, his face twisted with rage and satisfaction. "You're insane!" I screamed through the crackling roar of the fire. He sneered. "You left me with nothing, Evelyn. Nothing. If I can't have this house, I'll watch it burn before I let you keep it." The heat pressed against my skin, searing and merciless. But I didn't back down. "Not this time. You didn't lose this house, Richard." I shot back. "You lost yourself. You destroyed everything we had long before this trial. The fire you started tonight only proves what I've known for years. You were never a man, only a coward." His eyes blazed hotter than the flames behind me. He stepped closer, fists clenched. "Careful, Evelyn. You've poked the beast." But before he could lunge, flashing red and blue lights flooded the driveway. Sirens wailed as fire trucks screeched to a halt, followed by police cruisers. Richard's smug grin faltered. 2 officers leapt from their cars, guns drawn. "Step away from the house. Hands where we can see them." Richard froze, his bravado shattering like glass. The gas can at his feet was damning evidence enough. When he tried to stammer an excuse, "It wasn't me. She's lying," she said it herself. The officers silenced him with handcuffs and rights read aloud. I stood trembling, smoke stinging my lungs, as firefighters rushed to tame the blaze. The estate was scarred, but not lost. The flames had gutted one wing, but the main structure stood firm. Just like me. And Richard, for the first time in his life, he wasn't just beaten. He was finished. Later, at the police station, I gave my statement in detail. The officer nodded gravely as I recounted the threats, the phone calls, the letter. When I was finished, he said, "Mrs. Carter, with the evidence we've gathered, there's no chance he'll walk away from this. He'll be facing arson, attempted destruction of property, and violation of your court orders. He's looking at years in prison." The words sank into me like a soothing balm. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted peace. Richard had crossed his final line, and now the law would ensure he could never hurt me again. In the weeks that followed, repairs began on the estate. Neighbors and even strangers offered support, bringing food, flowers, and kind words. Clara visited often, helping me rebuild not just the house, but my spirit. One evening, as we sat together on the porch overlooking the partially restored gardens, Clara spoke softly. "You know, Evelyn, he thought fire could erase your strength. But all he did was show everyone else what I already knew. You can't be broken." I held her hand, my heart swelling with gratitude. I didn't survive this alone. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. She smiled. "And now, you're stronger than ever." Richard's trial for arson began a month later. I didn't attend every hearing. I didn't need to. But on the final day, when the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, I was there. The judge's words echoed like justice itself. "Mr. Carter, your actions demonstrate not only malice but recklessness. You sought to destroy property that was never yours, and in doing so endangered lives. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in state prison." Richard's face collapsed in disbelief. His threats, his arrogance, his fire, all extinguished in a single moment. As he was led away in chains, he turned his head, searching for me in the crowd. Our eyes met one last time. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply turned and walked away, because his story was over, and mine was just beginning again. That night, I lit a single candle in my grandmother's parlor, a symbol not of the fire Richard tried to use against me, but of the light that had guided me through it all. The estate was scarred, yes, but still standing, just like me, and as the flame flickered gently in the quiet room, I whispered to the memory of my grandmother. He lost everything, but I found myself. When the trial ended and Richard was sent away, silence returned to my life, but it wasn't the heavy silence of dread I had once lived with. It was the calm silence of peace. 4 months, I had been fighting battles in courtrooms, fighting fear in the dead of night, fighting the echo of Richard's threats in my mind. And now, there was nothing left to fight. The battlefield was cleared. The war was over. But healing is never instant. It is slow, like dawn breaking after a long and brutal night. Every morning, I walked the grounds of the Holloway estate. The fire had scarred one wing of the house, but the gardens were still alive. Roses bloomed defiantly, their petals bold against the blackened soil. I often found myself kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, whispering to the flowers as though they were old friends. Neighbors stopped by, offering encouragement, sometimes helping with repairs. I realized something powerful. Richard had tried to isolate me, to convince me I was powerless, but in reality, I had a community of people who admired my resilience. And every time someone said, "You're stronger than I could ever be," I smiled softly and answered, "Strength isn't born. It's built, one trial at a time." Clara remained by my side throughout the restoration. One evening, as we painted the walls of the damaged wing, she said, "Do you ever regret marrying him?" I thought about it. The years of manipulation, the lies, the betrayal, and then the way I had clawed my way back from it all. "No," I said finally, because regret means I wish it never happened. And if it never happened, I wouldn't be who I am now. I wouldn't know my own strength, and I wouldn't have reclaimed this house with the fire of my own will. Clara nodded, tears in her eyes. "Then he didn't take anything from you, Evelyn. He gave you clarity." Her words struck deep. Richard hadn't broken me. He had revealed me, stripped away the illusions until I saw myself clearly for the first time in years. The estate became a sanctuary again, not just for me, but for others. I opened its doors to community gatherings, charity events, even small weddings. Laughter filled the halls that once echoed with arguments. Music replaced the memory of slammed doors. I wasn't just preserving my grandmother's legacy anymore, I was expanding it. And every time I stood at the top of the staircase, watching people smile and celebrate in the home Richard tried to destroy, I felt her presence. I could almost hear her whisper, "Well done, Evelyn. Well done." One night, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire and gold, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. I thought of Richard, of the man he was when I first met him, charming and full of promises, and of the man he became, consumed by greed and rage. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity, because he had lost far more than an estate. He had lost his chance at love, his dignity, his future. And me, I had gained everything. Freedom, strength, peace. I leaned back, breathing in the cool evening air. "Grandma," I whispered to the wind, "your estate is safe. But more importantly, so am I." The trees rustled, and for a fleeting second, it felt like her spirit was answering me. And I realized something. This wasn't just the end of a painful chapter. It was the beginning of a new book entirely, one I would write on my own terms. If my story moved you, remember this: strength is built when we refuse to let betrayal define us. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground against someone who tried to break you? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. And if you found this journey inspiring, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss more powerful stories like this one. Thank you for watching.